Welcome, everybody, to Soccer 101. My name is Taylor Rockwell. This week, I am joined, as ever, by Mr. Graham Ruthven. Hello, Graham.
Hello, Taylor.
Hello, and we are here to discuss the French League, Ligue 1, which I will forever mispronounce according to French speakers. I do apologize. And maybe, just maybe, if the league were better, I wouldn't have to mispronounce it. That's my way of introducing the concept of today. Essentially, why does Ligue 1 have the reputation of being a farmers' league? Why does it have the reputation of
Wow,
being
you went there
not
straight
as...
away.
I mean, that's what people say, right? And I think that is an unfair way to categorize it, but it is perceived as maybe the fifth best league in Europe and therefore the world. It is a league that has lots and lots of strengths and reasons why people should be enthusiastic to watch it. It has a passionate fan base. It's one of the best leagues in the world for youth development and talent production. Clubs like Lyon and Monaco have had impressive European runs. The league has been working to improve its global visibility, but there is still an idea that it is not that strong of a league, that you don't get as much consistent competition and high-level competition at that, Graham. So we're going to try to delve into it today to get to the bottom of it and figure out where we can go from here.
Yeah, I mean, the core of this discussion is France is, if you were listing soccer nations, France would be near the top, right? They've made the last two World Cup finals. On the women's side as well, they have a successful national team, haven't won the Women's World Cup, but have nonetheless been there or thereabouts. And so many of the elite level players in Europe are French. There was that period, like maybe about 8 years ago, where France was producing more elite level players than any other country. But for whatever reason, this has not translated into France having one of the absolute best leagues in the world, if we're talking about comparatively to those other soccer nations like England or Spain or even Germany. Ligue 1 operates on a lower level. So we're going to try and delve into why that is the case on today's episode.
And before we start with the present, let's go to the past, Graham. Has this sort of always been the case in your mind? Because we have had strong runs, dynastic teams. Lyon would be one fairly recently. PSG, obviously, more recently. But historically, I don't think we have seen a ton of success coming out of French clubs in European competitions. Only the one team has ever won the European Cup or the Champions League. That'd be Marseille in 1993. No French clubs have ever won the UEFA Cup or the Europa League. I think Marseille were the last French club to make the final in 2018. So we don't have this sort of legacy of European success that has sort of fallen by the wayside.
And those facts that you just mentioned there, Taylor, are quite striking. I saw a map on Reddit when I was researching for this question, and basically the way that this map was plotted was if you had won the European Cup, you got a big dot against that club. If it was the UEFA Cup, it was a slightly smaller dot. And you look across Europe, there's dots everywhere, large dots, small dots, with one very large country in Western Europe as a notable exception, which is France. There was one dot for Marseille for that European Cup win in 1993, which, by the way, came at a time when there were all sorts of questions about that Marseille team. So even that triumph was not a particularly clean triumph, at least in terms of the discussion around that team. So, yeah, it's a bit of an anomaly. I do think the Big Five concept is quite a modern thing. I was looking at the coefficient history, as long as UEFA has had a coefficient since the start of they brought that in for the start of the Champions League, which was in the 90s. Marseille actually won the first Champions League trophy. And France has sort of swapped positions with the Eredivisie and the Portuguese league top flight over a number of years. What I will say is, since Qatar bought PSG, like when was that, 14 years ago or something like that, Ligue 1 has been pretty steady as the fifth best league in Europe because they have had a flag bearer who's consistently contributing to that coefficient. But in terms of the depth of French football, still, even in 2025, it's not quite there. So it's an anomaly.
Yeah, I do think with that in mind, I had in my notes up front, we should say with PSG accepted when we talk about a lot of these things historically, because otherwise we're going to say it a lot. Because once you add PSG into the equation, it's hard to say they don't have as much of a global footprint, the league, when you have PSG, who have global branding and are one of the most popular kits to be worn by the youth of America, as we've talked about previously. So PSG simultaneously improves things and I would argue hurts things. But if we're establishing the foundation, it does feel like it has sort of been historically the case that you haven't had outside of France a ton of interest in domestic French football. And I think it starts with that lack of European success. I think historically when you have a team that establishes a dynasty like Ajax or Bayern Munich, or you have sort of tactical revolutionary teams like Inter and in the 60s, you're going to get then more of an interest in those domestic leagues where they're coming from. And you're going to then learn more about those teams and those leagues and the other teams they're in. And I think it creates more of a kind of self-sustaining cycle of interest and support and money, basically. And I think if you don't have that in France, you're still going to get the loyal kind of local fan bases. And I think for the longest time, that is kind of how it was sustained, with smaller investment going further. And that explains that kind of dynasty that Lyon had for so long that then gets obliterated when PSG come in and have all the money in the world to spend on all the players in the world.
Yeah, and I would even go further back than that, Taylor, to look at the root of when French domestic football is chasing its tail. So France, I didn't know this until I researched this episode. France didn't have a professional league until 1932, which is obviously a lot later than certainly England, who had the Football League from 1888. And from reading about how the French League was started in 1932, seemed quite messy, where there were a lot of, and not in the Lionel Messi PSG sense, there were a lot of big clubs, typically in the north of France, that were quite happy with their amateur situations, and so they felt the league was an artificial construct. They felt the league was creating arbitrary targets for them to meet and for them to join the league. And so it wasn't until a number of years after 1932 that the big French clubs started to join the French league as well. So it feels like maybe even that set French football back, where they're already playing catch up with some of the other big European nations. Of course, not long after 32, something significant happens in Western Europe as well, which also set back French football, I think maybe more than English football and Italian football. So I think even there is a legacy of French domestic football being behind their counterparts.
To jump to the present day, Graham, I want to ask you this to make sure we're on the same page. A thing that I did feel like kind of important to look into, and I think I'm a bit more mixed than I was prior to starting researching this episode, is the French league actually weaker, or do we just perceive it to be actually weaker? Because I think the PSG run of domination, and then that being preceded by Lyon winning 8, 9, 10 titles in a row, I think it always gave me this idea that, a little bit of money and you can fully dominate the league. But I also think we've seen other clubs win titles and challenge for silverware, and I think we've seen clubs make runs in Europe. We've also seen a ton of teams kind of have one-off seasons where everybody stays and everybody is there, and they put together a really great kind of run of results. So I do think in some ways Ligue 1 is much more competitive than I think we tend to give it credit for.
I mean, if you take PSG out of the equation, that would absolutely be the case. And look, Ligue 1, I probably watch more Ligue 1 than I do Bundesliga, just because Bundesliga's on at the kind of unusual times for me, and also their TV deal in the UK is trash. Ligue 1 is on TNT, which is quite easy for me to watch, and so I will watch quite a number of Ligue 1 games. I think the quality is, it's negligible, the difference between a lower rung Ligue 1 game and a La Liga game or a Bundesliga game. But you have to look at, the best way I can answer this is you have to look at the finances that these Ligue 1 clubs have. And this has been probably the biggest issue that Ligue 1 has faced over its entire existence, has been relative to the other big five leagues. They don't have as much money. So obviously PSG are the exception to this with their Qatari ownership.
As I said, PSG accepted. We have to establish that as a precedent.
Yeah, we're going to say that a few times in this episode. But I found a study that said the average player budget of a Ligue 1 club is 42% lower than the average player budget of a Premier League club. It's 18% lower than a La Liga club. It's 17% lower than a Bundesliga club. So, that has to have a factor on the talent that has to be a factor in the talent that's coming into the league. Of course, then the question becomes, well, why don't these clubs have as much money? I think there are countless theories and things that we can go into. But yeah, the best way I can answer that question, Taylor, is you look at the finances. Joe's a big advocate of basically the talent ends up where the money dictates, broadly speaking. And so if Ligue 1 clubs don't have as much money as other big five leagues, that says to me that maybe the quality isn't as high as in the big five leagues as well.
I think it's a cycle, and a vicious cycle at that, because let's look at the finances for a moment. Let's look specifically at the TV deal. The TV deal is significantly less valuable than the Premier League, La Liga, the Bundesliga, and I think that does lead to an immediate financial gap where French clubs can't compete for top talent because they don't have as much money coming in on a regular basis. And even in the way the league is perceived, that TV deal that they signed that was going to change it all and provide all the money that immediately collapses. Was it
Yeah.
Media Pro that falls
Media Pro,
apart
yeah.
immediately? And then they have to kind of settle for the scraps that they can put together. And it's harder to watch then in certain areas. It's harder to watch over here in the States. But it also means that you don't have as much money. You don't have as much consistency in that money. And clubs can't count on that revenue to then help them invest in either players or in facilities or what you might need to attract and keep those big names.
Yeah. I think you look at the TV deal that they've currently got as well with DAZN. Apparently they want to renegotiate the deal. They've been withholding payments the last few months. So French football just continually ends up in this same cycle. If listeners don't know, the Media Pro deal that they struck was worth 3.3 billion euros. It was agreed in 2018. It was meant to be this game changer for Ligue, and it was going to bring them onto a level of certainly of La Liga and Serie A, if not the Premier League. Media Pro didn't even keep up their payments for 4 months. That deal collapsed, and that meant Ligue 1 didn't have any TV revenue. They had to cobble together a TV deal, I think, with Canal Plus for a season or two, which was worth a fraction of what they'd agreed with Media Pro. And clubs are still feeling the impact of this. A lot of them had spent money anticipating this deal. Bordeaux went bankrupt. Lyon have had financial issues. There are countless French clubs, big French clubs as well, that have had real financial issues in the last few years. And as I say, it's continued. DAZN want to renegotiate their current deal, which is worth 400 million euros, which is obviously a lot less already than the Media Pro deal. So this has been a never-ending cycle for the league. Another thing, just when we're talking about the money side of things, in researching this episode, one of the things I kept coming across is how much French clubs are taxed. So apparently last year, the top 3 clubs in France paid more in tax than the whole of the Bundesliga and the whole of Serie A last season. And it's the same for players. They have an aggressive high earners tax band, which we can debate the societal benefits of that. But from a footballing point of view, it means it is harder to attract the best players if they're going to be taxed more in that country. So
I
that's
think
another obstacle.
As a good example of that, I think Zlatan, when he signs for PSG, knows that I think 70% of his salary is going to be taxed. And so he demands 170% of his salary, basically, so that the salary he ends up getting is the amount of money he wanted, and then basically the 70% is already included in there. So some players of a certain caliber, when they go to PSG, can find a way around that and can find a way to navigate it. But
I think
to your
the
point,
other trick,
Graham, you're going to run into those problems.
The other trick there, Taylor, is I think PSG have been accused of paying players as like an ambassador to Qatar.
Yeah.
And so that money isn't taxed. They're getting paid that in Qatar. And so I think that's another way that it's been alleged that they get around that.
And so what I think all that leads to is you don't have the kind of the TV revenue coming in. You have a perception that maybe it's a less stable league when you have Bordeaux and Lyon having the issues they have. The Premier League has had plenty of clubs that have financial problems and financial difficulties and fall into financial disrepair, basically. But I think because there's so much money and so much continued investment, that doesn't become a dominant storyline. Whereas in France, I think that tends to kind of stick with the league a little bit more, whether or not that's fair or unfair. And so what ends up happening, I think, as a result of those things is that there's a shift towards, then we'll be a selling league, and that's how you can guarantee revenue, even if a TV deal isn't going to do that, even if you're not going to have a ton of European success and have European money or European sponsorship or what it might be. We can at least have players come through and then we'll sell them on. And that's great because you then become the hotbed for youth development and academy players. But at the same time, if you're then selling on players as soon as they come good or as soon as they have a good season or two, you're never really going to have sustained periods of success anymore because you're always moving on your best players, even if you replace them with academy players, even if you are spending a little bit of money to bring in some quality to replace them. It's just is going to lead to much more up and down cycles for teams where you're not then going to have this consistently raised bar of competition.
Yeah, it's a self-perpetuating thing, isn't it, where you establish that idea of being a selling league, and actually not La Liga, Ligue 1 has leaned into this. Their current tagline, I think, is the League of Talents, which leans into this idea: come and watch Ligue 1. You might not watch, Messi, or not now Messi, or Mbappe, not now Mbappe either, but you might watch the future Mbappe or the future Messi, or someone who's going to move to the Premier League in a couple of years and be the superstar. And you can say you watched this player, you knew about this player before anyone else. So that has become I think that's quite a good way to sell the league, but it puts a ceiling on what it can achieve, right? It can never be a league that competes against the Premier League or even La Liga with Real Madrid and Atletis and Barcelona. And I was trying to find the root of that idea, Taylor, that Ligue 1 with the French top flight was a selling league, and my research took me to the 90s. So I think one of the things that is counted against Ligue 1 is there have been crises, that's multiple for the plural for crisis, right? And at inopportune times for the league. So the 90s, basically, that was such a important period of growth for the Premier League. The 90s, certainly towards the end of that decade, Serie A as well was a good period for Serie A. But the 90s in French football had a number of financial and match fixing and doping scandals, which really impacted the global impression of French league football. And what's interesting about this period of time was that obviously that decade finishes with France winning the World Cup for the first time on home soil. So many of those players, because of the way that French domestic football was perceived at that time, or even they didn't have the money to pay those players. You go through that team, they're all playing abroad. They're playing in Serie A, they're playing in the Premier League, and so that really entrenched this idea that La Liga was a developmental league. And when you have this top level French team, but none of them play in Ligue 1, and that was a really iconic team. What do they call that? The rainbow team, the French team that won the 98 World Cup. Became this iconic team in France and around the world. And you look at them, none of them are playing in Ligue 1. That really, it became this self-perpetuating thing.
And I do think this is where the PSG of it all has to be discussed as well, because if you didn't have PSG coming in with the money they've had to be able to sign the players that they have, like maybe then with the winning the World Cup in 98 and this idea that you have so many talented players coming through French academies, there would be more of an emphasis on let's keep them in the league and let's keep different teams winning and let's see how we can put these players together and keep them in France to then have them reach new heights and have clubs reach new heights and have maybe then some European campaigns. But it feels like ultimately all teams are doing is trying to see if they can find a way to be competitive with PSG, ultimately, because they have so much money, so much spending power. They're the first team to be successful in the French capital of Paris. Like it just puts them... It's such a strange thing because it brings immediate eyeballs to the league in a certain way because there's going to be interest in, oh, they've signed this guy, oh, they've signed that guy, oh, will this work, oh, they've signed this manager and that manager. People are then going to take interest, but they're only taking interest in one team in the competition, and they're really only taking interest from a let's watch the train wreck unfold or let's see if this is a train wreck, but there is less sort of general interest and enthusiasm for the league. And so it's an odd one because PSG has certainly brought more visibility and more awareness to the French league, I think, and at the same time has probably hurt its development, hurt the idea that anybody can win in any given season, and so it ultimately becomes PSG and the rest of Ligue 1, essentially.
Yeah, and one of the sliding door moments for Ligue 1 in the last sort of 15 years was Monaco, and the fact that they were bought by a Russian oligarch called Dmitry Rybovlev. I've absolutely butchered that name, but that's how it looks to me spelt. And for a while, they spent a bit of money. They brought in Radamel Falcao, they brought in James Rodriguez, and I think that the reason I say that's a sliding door moment.
Kylian Mbappe, right?
Kylian Mbappe comes through at Monaco at that time. That's slightly later. I think that comes after the sliding door moments that I'm about to talk about. But basically, there was a period where PSG had genuine competition. They had a club that could compete against them on a relatively even footing. And then the Russian owner, I was just trying to very quickly Google what happened. Was he not divorced? He's not divorced,
yep.
Right? That was the story.
I think I don't know if it still is. Certainly at the time, it was the most expensive divorce settlement in history. It might have been surpassed by Jeff Bezos, but I think it's still this one. And so, he loses an insane amount of money and basically can't just have multiple different playthings to throw money into, so he has to trim down a little bit.
So all of a sudden, Monaco, their strategy completely changes. To be fair, one of the best pivots or most effective pivots must be in like football club history, where you have Monaco spending a bunch of money. They then can't do that anymore. Okay, we're going to be a team and a club that brings through young talents, and Monaco do that pretty much as well as anyone else. But they have that team that makes the Champions League semi-finals. I think the Mbappe team Bernardo Silva's in that team. Thomas Lamar's in that team. They have an incredible team at that point. Bakayoko, who was good before he went to Chelsea. And then what happens? They can't sustain the finances when these players want new contracts. They sell them on, and Kylian Mbappe goes to PSG, which just completely keeps the cycle going in Ligue 1. So they were so close to having something there, but it fell away pretty quickly.
And I really do think Exhibit A in the like how dominant are PSG is that Mbappe goes to PSG in the same summer as Neymar and his 250 million euro transfer or whatever it was. And I think, and I hear what you're saying about Monaco and how it is a sliding doors moment. At the same time, it's still Monaco, which is itself seen as like the playground of the rich and the elite. And so you have Paris versus Monaco. If he had bought like Nice, maybe, or if he had bought like Montpellier, I don't know. I don't know my French geography that well. But I think it also further solidifies this idea that like the elites have it all and all of the other French clubs are kind of fighting for the scraps that fall off the table. And so it would have maybe brought more interest because you could have two teams vying for supremacy, but I think it also would have created further stratification at the same time.
Yeah. Taylor, when you mention like Monaco obviously being playground for the rich, and I don't know if you've seen their stadium. What's it called? The Stade Louis II or whatever it is. It's on top of a car park.
That
I've never
doesn't
actually
dispel the idea that it's for the rich. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but the point I'm trying to make is they don't get big crowds at their games,
Right.
and so with one of the things I was tackling with research in this episode was, does France have the football ecosystem that England has, that Italy has, that Germany has? Like, do they care as a country more? Do they care as much about soccer as other countries do? And that's not to say there aren't hotbeds. Like Marseille is a soccer daft city. You go to the north of France, there's real fervent, passionate fan bases there. But look at the attendances, right? So France has pretty much the same population as the UK. So England actually has, once you take the other home nations out, England actually has a slightly smaller population than France, but Ligue 1 ranks 10th in the world for average attendances. The Bundesliga is first, the Premier League is second, La Liga is third, Serie A is fourth. You even have the English Championship and the second Bundesliga ranking ahead of Ligue 1, which the average attendance is just over 21,000, which, by the way, is less than MLS in Ligue 1 averages in attendances. And so those figures are interesting because it speaks to this idea about France that maybe, as I say, it's maybe not quite as passionate about soccer as some of its European neighbours. We've spoken on the main feed before about Paris not being a soccer city in the same way that London is. And I just wonder if France has a more like sort of diverse sporting landscape than England does, than Germany does, than Italy does. I mean, there's over 1 million registered tennis players in France. Basketball is huge in France. Rugby is really popular, particularly in the south of the country. I think the French national team, I think they're playing Scotland this weekend and can win the Six Nations for like the umpteenth time if they beat Scotland. They've got the Tour de France. Cycling is really popular in France. Handball apparently is really popular in France. So it's similar to the US sporting landscape where, yes, soccer is big, but you have so much competition for eyeballs and for people to spend money. And so I just wonder if that's a really important factor in explaining why French domestic soccer isn't up there with the Premier League.
It could be. And I think this goes in line with that. But I think it's also, there's a period of time, and France for the longest time fully embodies this, in which, I think this is in Soccernomics, the idea that like nations' capitals are not where you go to find successful soccer clubs, that throughout like the 80s and 90s, if you think in England, the dominant teams are in Liverpool and Manchester, basically, with Arsenal peppered in along the way. But in Italy, it's Milan and Juve, and Napoli to some extent, not Rome. In Germany, certainly not a lot of Berlin teams winning titles. Spain might be the outlier there with Madrid, but for the longest time, I mean, PSG's founded in like 82, right? Or like not particularly long ago. I think for the longest time, you have maybe more regional powers, more regional players where there is more of that hotbed as you've talked about. And I think Lyon is probably an example of that. Marseille is certainly an example of that. And so, yeah, I think maybe then there is a perception that you don't have as much sort of sustained and fervent interest in some of those capitals, and Paris is probably one of those. There is a lot to do and see in Paris, so I don't fully begrudge them that one. But I do...
Disneyland. You're talking about Disneyland, right?
Of course, yes, Euro Disney. That's the one where the robots come alive and fight the Simpsons. Was that Euro Disney? I forget which one. But either way, I do think that like it all plays a part in our perception of French football. And it's just such a strange one because, again, seen in a vacuum, you have some of the best players in the world coming through French academies at a very young age, some of the most expensive players in the world coming through French academies at a very young age. And you do wonder what would happen if that, like, the players could make more and you had like more money for clubs and fewer money for taxes. I like taxes though, they're fine. But like it does feel like there is a world in which France could have one of the best leagues in the world instead of one of the like second tier leagues in the world.
Yeah. Taylor, do you think there's anything to the language theory that I found, which basically is the Premier League is at the centre of the English language world. La Liga, which is probably on balance the second strongest league in the world, at least commercially. It's obviously has the Spanish language, and so French is obviously spoken all around the world, but maybe not in markets that lead to the growth of a soccer league. Like, Spanish obviously in South America is huge. In that sense, English is obviously the language.
I think that's an understatement, but yeah.
I mean, and what was I trying to say? I was trying to say, like, in soccer countries, Spanish is spoken widely, and so then that funnels maybe into the Spanish leagues. Or you even see it with Portugal, right? Portugal, there's a real trade route in football terms between Brazil and Portugal for obvious reasons. So with France, like, I did see a theory that maybe the French language doesn't help France in a domestic sense.
I mean, I'm coming at this from an American perspective. I do wonder if maybe the perception of France in the United States is part of that, and maybe the language barrier is also a part. That might just be an American thing. I will say I'm a bad person to ask because I grew up in a house where my mom was obsessed with the Olympics, and so I learned at a young age that you would always hear over the broadcast the language of the host nation, and then you would hear French. And so I was always taught that, like, French is the international language. My mom very much wanted me to take French so I could be a truly international person. Latin didn't really get the job done, it turns out. So you might be right in terms of there being that sort of barrier because you have, like, South America is already speaking the same language as La Liga. You've got large chunks of North America, or maybe two large chunks of North America already speaking English, so maybe there's the natural attraction to the Premier League, whereas you don't get that with France. I also wonder how much, how do I want to phrase this? The legacy of colonial France factors into things, because there is so often the conversation, and I think that can be distilled down to like black players for the French national team and North African players for the French national team saying that when we win, we're French. When we lose, we're immigrants. And is there an idea that, like, you don't have as much embracing of players from disparate backgrounds within France and within the French league? That is definitely painting with a very broad brush, but it is a sustained issue and talking point for the French national team. So I do then wonder if that also kind of bleeds into the discourse and dialogue about domestic French football as well.
Yeah, it's possible. There was another theory that I saw about France that being able to send players around Europe more freely because of the EU making free movement around Europe easier. So the Schengen zone, as it's called, it comes in the mid-80s. And obviously, France is right at the centre of that, right at the centre of Western Europe. So players can, I'm talking about on a day-to-day lifestyle basis. It's easier for a French player to move to Germany, which is just over the border, or they can go to Italy, which is just over the border. They can go to Spain, which is just over the border, and that's maybe not the same for players in England or even players in Italy going in the other direction. So, I thought there might be something to that as well.
That makes sense. So you're advocating for a French Brexit?
Sure, yeah, it's
That'll
worked
make
so
them
well
better.
for us, yeah.
So if we're concluding with, like, what is the future of Ligue 1, what do we feel like could be the potential for that league? I don't think that there is a realistic possibility of them surpassing the Premier League, certainly anytime soon. I do think that there is an opportunity for them, maybe not in the Bundesliga, but like Serie A potentially, La Liga potentially, with the idea that Real Madrid, Barcelona, and Atleti are always going to be big draws. I think those leagues, in my mind, this is very much me, like, sort of talking from my perspective, but Spain and Italy in particular feel very old boys. It is an old boys network. It is the kind of teams that you expect to always win are going to be the teams that always win. And France, PSG accepted, like there is a feeling that you could have teams, if they're able to keep some of that talent together, they could put a title challenge together. They could put a European run together. And does that money allow them to keep that team together to kind of keep growing and developing? But I also feel like I have fewer French clubs that I'm like, it's PSG and then it's them and then it's them, and we know who the top three is going to be. It could be Marseille one season. It could be Lyon the next. Less likely to be Lyon presently with the financial situations, but Montpellier have had moments where they look like they could be a strong team for a period of time. Bordeaux, again, less likely now, but they had a good run there. You've had Lille, like in moments, look very, very strong. They're still in the Champions League at time of recording. It does feel like a league where you can have teams kind of pop up and be good for a couple seasons, and in that way, I think there can be interest, because then it can start to feel like the French league is one where you're going to get interesting teams playing each other every single weekend, and you might get one league winner one season and one league winner the next, with PSG accepted.
See, I like that idea, Taylor, of unpredictability below PSG, of course. But I don't know whether... I often think the real leverage in growing a league is actually the clubs rather than the league. And so with Serie A, I am always going to be on some level interested in, no matter how they're really doing, I'm going to be interested in AC Milan. I'm going to be interested in Inter. I'm going to be interested in Juventus. It's the same with the Premier League. It's why we talk about Manchester United so much, is because there's that cachet, that legacy that they have as a club. And for one reason or another, France just hasn't built up those clubs. I think PSG have done it now. They've been successful for so long, for the last 15 years under Qatari ownership, that they probably do have that legacy now. But beyond that, Saint Etienne were dominant in the 70s. They make a European Cup final in 1976. They're now second bottom of Ligue 1. They haven't been able to sustain that. You mentioned Montpellier won that league. Was that the Giroud team, the Montpellier team that won? Mm-hmm. Yep. Bordeaux won a league title. Marouane Chamakh, I think of him leading the line for that team.
Don't we?
None of these teams are able to sustain this over a long enough period of time for them to establish that legacy. And so I like the idea, Taylor, of a competitive league where it's maybe less predictable, but actually does that in real-world terms grow the league? I would argue that having clubs without the legacy of the clubs I've just mentioned in Italy and Spain and Germany is actually the more detrimental thing.
So what do you think, Graham? What is the best possible future for the French league then?
I think leaning into what they're doing just now, this tagline, the League of Talents, I think it's quite smart. I mean, we know
the League of Players who will one day play for Chelsea.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, it puts a ceiling on what that league can be ultimately. But in the immediate term, or at least in the next 10 years, because no matter what they do in the next 10 years, they're not going to match the Premier League. We experience it with the Discord and obviously the scouting network that you and Daryl used to do. People love being invested in players from a young age and feeling some sort of ownership of them. So, yeah, sure, the next superstar forward who comes through at Lens and goes and plays for Chelsea maybe isn't going to be playing in Ligue 1 week on week as in their peak years, but somewhere there is an investment in Ligue 1. There's an emotional investment in Ligue 1 in that player. And so I think that's probably quite a smart strategy, but I just don't see a world, particularly in the FFP age. Like previously, you could maybe envisage these clubs being cheap as anything. They've got access to the Champions League. They've got access to European competition. They're going to be attractive to rich businessmen to plough cash into. Now you've got FFP and these financial restrictions, which makes it much more difficult. So I just don't envisage a world where Ligue 1 is ever considered the best league in the world. And we've got decades of evidence to suggest why that'll never be the case.
One last hypothetical for you that I'm not sure I buy into, because I don't love oil states owning clubs as a fundamental point. However, with PSG, who I do think we've kind of laid out a little bit of why they have been detrimental in certain ways to growing the league and growing interest in the league. For so long it has been, they're going to win the title, who cares? Or maybe they're not going to win the title, but even there, it's always in relation to that club. To have it be a one-club league is not the perception you want, unless that club is likable. And this, I would say, is the most likable iteration of PSG we have had in a time that I can remember. So let's say this particular PSG team under Luis Enrique, who have academy players coming through, who have certainly spent money, but not the way they did when they had Messi and Neymar and Mbappe in that team. if they are a more likable PSG, does that help the league to have a team that is enjoyable and well coached win the title and win the Champions League? Does that maybe generate more interest?
My answer is probably no.
Okay.
I just think, we are talking. That's obviously subjective, likable, right? So we're talking. I would agree with you. This current PSG team, I find much more likable. I enjoy watching them. But I think in a broader sense, particularly if you're talking about younger fans, the most likable PSG team was probably the one that had Lionel Messi, and they didn't capitalise on that. I mean, they were unfortunate in that Messi signed just after the Media Pro collapse, but I didn't see any concerted push from the league into new markets to get games in front of more eyeballs. Speaking personally, it wasn't easier for me to watch Ligue 1 games when Messi was in that league. I guess you could argue that on the merch front, Messi helped shift a lot of PSG jerseys, maybe made an impact on young fans in particular. But PSG were already doing that with Mbappe and Neymar and the Air Jordan deal in particular. I actually feel like MLS has done more to capitalise on Messi, and there's a discussion about whether they could be doing even more on that front. But Ligue 1, when they had Messi, it was a missed opportunity. And so if Lionel Messi, the greatest player of all time, the most marketable player of all time, didn't make an impact for Ligue 1, then I don't really know if Bradley Barcola, as good as cool as his step-overs are, and as likeable as his work rate is, I don't know if that's going to do the job.
All right. Well, I don't know if we have solved the future of the French league for now, but I've enjoyed this conversation. I've enjoyed talking about the roots and the issues and the history of the competition and where we go from here. So, Graham Ruthven, thank you for chatting it all out with me today. I would say more things in French, but again, I didn't take it, so I can't.
Yeah, I would also do that, Taylor, but the only French that I know relates to food, and I didn't think you'd want Boursin on your croissant. So, thank you very much.
But I would like some escargot and some chablis. Yeah? Did I nail it? I got it right? I did that.
Do you want that with your fromage?
Exactly, yes. Okay, cool. Now that we've angered everybody with all of the pronunciations, thank you, Graham Ruthven, for joining me this week.
Thank you, Taylor Rotwell.
Listeners, thank you all as well for joining us. And I guess merci beaucoup. And we will talk to you again next week.